Hi, everyone. So I'm continuing my series of reviewing Mindsight by Dr. Dan Siegel. I am on chapter 4, which he calls the Complexity Choir, which is quite beautiful. And in a minute, you'll understand what he's talking about. So here he starts off by talking about really what is mental health, what does it mean to when we talk about well-being. He reviews some of the studies and he says, when you deal with people who deal with emotional health or things of that nature, we have found in studies that happy people, so people who consider themselves happy and would, for all intents and purposes, be doctors would agree are happy people, have some things in common. They show gratitude, which is why I always have my clients do gratitude practices. They show compassion, which is why that's probably the number one thing I work on with parents. They have open-mindedness and they have curiosity. However, he goes on to say that there's not a lot of studies that hone in on exactly how we achieve this well-being. And of course, Dr. Siegel says, in his practice and in his, I think, studies and research, he really believes that integration is the key to all of this. And just to review, this is my dog, Zelda. He basically says that integration is the linkage of differentiated parts, right? So when you can link together parts that are separate, you can get away from rigidity and chaos and move toward cultivating this beautiful awareness and mindsight. So I think this is the beginning of where we're going to kind of see how he has put together Mindsight and get a little look into what he's doing. So he offers this quick little illustration of exactly what he means. So he says, oftentimes when he has a group of people and he starts talking about this concept, what he does is he asks for volunteers to come to the front and he says, we're going to form a makeshift choir. And he says, so I want you guys to all start by finding one note that you can all sing and all singing it together. So people come up, they all sing one note, right? And then he puts up his hand and he says, okay, now I would like you to, everybody in this group, to cover their ears so you can't hear the other people and sing any song you want. So that occurs and the audience is paying attention and he holds up his hand and then he says, and now I want you to all agree on one song to sing together. And he said, amazingly enough, more than half of the time people choose Amazing Grace, which is interesting because if you look up Amazing Grace, it's known as one of the most harmonizing songs that, and I think that's an amazing tidbit on its own. And he talks to the audience and basically the audience says that, during that third part where they're all singing the same song, there's this feeling of, he says, vitality. Basically, it's the integration of all of the people in the choir, right? All the voices, right? The complexity is more than just the individual parts, right? They're coming together, they're integrating together, and you can almost feel it. And then he goes back and he talks about the first two things he has them do. And in the first one, it is an example of rigidity, right? You're all singing the exact same note. No one can stray. And there's only so long that you stay on that path before it almost feels irritating and confined. And even the audience feels that. And then he talks about the second thing he had them do where you're covering your ears And basically, because none of you are on the same page, it's a cacophony of sound. It's very chaotic, and it does not, sound or feel good to the ear or anyone who is participating. So this complexity of the choir, right, just illustrates the idea of why he believes in integration. And he has said in many books, I don't even know how many books I've read about him, but in a lot of his books, he talks about this kind of river of integration. Now, before he came up with the theory of integration, I want to say, like, when he did Whole Brain Child, I don't think they called it integration, but he did call it the flow of this natural harmonious river. And I love this picture. He uses it over and over again. I think it does a very good job, right? If you think of integration and harmony as a river, a flowing river, what happens is it's boarded, right, on either side, right? Either shore of the river. One side is rigidity, the other side is chaos. And sometimes when you're flowing down the river, you might get stuck up in the rigid part, and you're going to have to break yourself loose to continue in the flow of integration. And sometimes the opposite happens and you go towards the chaotic side. And I think it's really important that you think of everything we learn as tools to help you stay in the flow of that river. It doesn't mean there's not going to be obstacles that throw you up, right, into rigidity or chaos. That happens. That's life, right? That's how, the river is. You can't predict it. You kind of have to go with the flow. You have to be open. And there are obstacles that get in the way. And we have to use our tools kind of get back in that flow. He then goes on and he talks about emotion. And I thought this was an interesting tidbit. And I'm going to be looking at a couple of other books coming up that I might do as lives. So maybe I won't say them now, but deal a lot with emotion and behavior. That's one of my neuroscience and behavior, or one of my just guilty pleasures to look into. So emotion, he says, is really like a shift in your integration, right? And he looks at it as the kind of integration of multiple parts: your inner self, your mind, your relationships, and the overall world that you're living in, right? And when there's shifts in there, you tend to feel different emotions based on those shifts. I think that's kind of cool. I don't have any deep insight into that, but I think it's kind of a cool way to look at emotion. And then he does something which I did not expect. But he talks about complexity theory. And the interesting part for me in this is actually when I was in grad school, I became a part of a biodiversity study that literally was looking at chaos theory and complexity and the math behind it and integrating it with biology, and how when we look at a system, how all the different parts kind of come together. So for me, this is kind of, again, the universe saying, oh yes, no wonder you align with him so much. He is talking about this idea. It's based in mathematics. And basically, if you have a system that is an open system, so it's not closed, it has multiple parts, and it's capable of multiple things, including chaos, basically what you start to notice is there's what will emerge without any code for it, without any outer hand, is it will start to self-regulate, right? It starts to organize itself. So out of this chaos, you start to see organization. And it's basically the interaction of all these different parts cause this organization. So out of, right, chaos, you get organization, which seems like it would not occur, but that's actually what happens in all these different systems. And he talks about this flow of integrated systems, again, relating it back to the river. And he says, when you're in harmonious flow, how you stay in harmonious flow, or I think what's more important is how you kind of have a checklist of if you're feeling like you're getting stuck and it doesn't feel so integrated or harmonious, there are different things to look at. And his acronym, because he's a huge fan of acronyms, is FACES. F is flexible, A is adaptable, C is coherent, E is energized, and S is stable. So this to me is one of those checklists, especially for my kids. If I'm noticing things are out of balance and they're tending to not be well integrated, and when I deal with this, I actually talk about this with regulation a lot, because I also love Self-Reg by Stuart Shanker, which is another good book that maybe I could do. And part of being, this idea of well-being and being in that great place of harmonious integration is also being well regulated. But in order to do that, you have to have all of these things. So I think it's fun that he gave us it in his words, and it's something that I utilize actually as like a checklist for myself. The end of this chapter, he goes over his specific 8 domains of integration. And he says that although he presents these, 1 through 8, they are not linear, okay? And sometimes they occur in combination with each other. And he sets us up to have a future chapters dedicated to each of these. So I suspect, based on what he said, that we will start getting personalized stories as examples of each of these domains of integration. So I'm going to go over them, and good for you, it's not a really long. I know last time it was a really long video. This is a short video, relatively short. So the first is the integration of consciousness. And this is basically how you focus your attention, and it's basically the key to integration of the brain. Or when I talk to people, this is the first step, is always awareness, right? And he actually says this is how you harness awareness, because in order for there to be a choice, right, we have to be able to acknowledge what states we're in. He says, I think, emotional states, without being overtaken by them. Now, this relates back to regulation, right, that I was just talking about in self-reg. And with kids, it is very difficult for them to do that. So this stage, right, this consciousness, the integration of consciousness within yourself is a very difficult journey. And I think that it is the key, right, because it's saying, I want you to be aware of how you're feeling inside the body, inside the mind, all the things that are occurring. However, we're not going to let that take over and run us, right? And when we deal with kids and amygdala hijack or fight, flight, or freeze, those interactions tend to take over because they're so rooted in that reptilian brain of ours that it's hard not to let them take over. When you integrate consciousness, it gives us a window to be able to say, I recognize that I'm really angry, right? And it gives us space enough not to react just based on that anger. And this, just so you know, when I talk to clients, I sometimes work with my coaching clients and say, recognizing and being aware is the first step, and it's a huge win. If you could recognize as it's occurring that you're super sad, that you're overwhelmed, that you're anxious, that you're angry, any of those emotions are so important to recognize in the moment. So this is, I liked this. He said, this is the seeing ourselves as it's happening or as we are. And I would say, if you haven't watched my Radical Acceptance, that's also accepting, right? things as they are without judgment, right? Just because I feel angry doesn't mean I'm an angry person, doesn't mean I'm a bad person. I just feel this certain way right now. And also releasing the expectations of how we should be based on the situation, which again, related to radical acceptance is I am not judging those emotions and I have let go of expectations. So I've talked, I know, ad nauseum about accepting and not expecting, because you set yourself up for failure when you have set expectations and you're not willing to accept what is actually occurring. Okay. And then he follows that up by saying, this opens us up to perceptions of the world, our own body, relationships, and even our own mind. This is the beginning of being aware. And he mentions the awareness hub, which makes me think that he's going to talk about his wheel of awareness practice. He doesn't specifically go into anything else about it, but I'm pretty sure that the fact that he mentions it briefly means that we're going to get introduced to it later on in the book. And if we don't, I'll do a follow-up epilogue and introduce you to it. Okay, number 2 is horizontal integration. And horizontal integration is the integration of the left brain and the right brain. Many people are familiar with this type of delineation. Right brain is the first one to develop. It's your creative imagery, nonverbal, autobiographical. It's how you start thinking about yourself, your memory, your holistic thinking, right, is all right brain. And then your left brain is, that usually develops later, and it is the logic, the spoken and written word, linear lists, literal thinking. That's your left brain. And the thing is, we used to talk about left and right brained as you were only left or right brained. I don't think that that's the case. And I think if you look at current research, they agree that this is not the case for children either. However, we have a tendency to lean one way or the other, right? Especially if it serves us well, right? If it has served us well for giving us the tools or expressing ourselves or relating to others, then we tend to lean one way or the other. It also means if you're leaning one way or the other, you may not be fully integrating those two things. And we need to fully integrate those two things to be whole and take advantage of all of the amazing things that we have to offer, right? And it's kind of like developmentally when we think about our kids, we really want them to integrate that left and right brain, right? All right, number 3, maybe 3, is vertical integration. And basically that's easy to think of because our whole bodies are vertical. And so if you think of your nervous system, emanating in the brain, spreading out throughout your body all the way down to your toes and all the way back up, vertical integration. That nervous system integration can really be disrupted by tons of different things. Physical injury or trauma, emotional trauma. This is also when people are not, I would even go on to say that this leads to embodiment. So I deal with some of my clients with embodiment issues because oftentimes when you have had trauma, right, or you're reacting to something that has been a constant occurrence in your life, you get disengaged from your body and you lose the ability to really plug into your intuition, to plug into the different parts of your body and what's going on. So for me, he doesn't talk about that. I just think that this is where I would put embodiment, and embodiment exercises and toolbox is really in vertical integration and being able to connect it, right? Your gut brain, bringing it back in where you're feeling all these different things and really tapping into them and bringing them back in is really vertical integration. And I think some people are very good at vertical integration, and I think a lot of people completely ignore it. And I think that's why we've seen the trend in embodiment and the body keeps score, and all of those things. That's another book I could do. I'll just have a list of books and then maybe you vote on which ones you want to see. Okay. Number 4 is memory integration. And here he briefly talks about implicit memory and explicit memory. Implicit memory is the first memories that you get. It starts at once you're a fully formed human. You might not even remember. It is the mental models that occur without thought, without us putting them together, without the prefrontal cortex going in and logically putting all these things together. Implicit memory actually affects us throughout our life, and sometimes we react with implicit memory without even knowing that we're doing it or why we're doing it, because we've forgotten or choose not to remember. Sometimes we avoid. And so this becomes a really major thing of integration. We have to tap into things that have occurred and have a really strong picture of implicit memory, and then using implicit memory, forming explicit memory. And this is the factual, the autobiographical information that comes in that we are aware of. We can take implicit and integrate it with explicit, and then we have a full story of basically who we are, why we are the way we are, or start understanding those bits of perhaps why we react, why we have the triggers we have. I think of this really clearly, if another Dan Siegel book is Parenting from Within. A lot of times as parents, if you're not a parent, you might have seen this with your parents parenting you. We react and then we say, where did that even come from? Right? Like, I have no idea why I reacted like that. And then we think back and we're like, oh my gosh, this is because I have this really strong memory of when I was a little girl, and this is what happened with my mom, and this is how she reacted. Sometimes it's copying the reaction, and sometimes it's the exact opposite because it's triggered this kind of really big trauma in us, and so we react the complete opposite, but it's a big reaction. This has to do with that integration of memory. All right, number 5 is the narrative integration. Narrative integration is the stories that we tell ourselves over and over, and it's from the right hemisphere, right? The right hemisphere of the brain integrating with the memory, right? That explicit memory that we have. And we tell ourselves stories. The stories that we tell ourselves are very important. And I think, sorry for my dogs. They're very important to recognize that we even tell ourselves that story. And I think the majority of my life, I did not realize that that was even a thing. I think not until I did my coaching training and then became a coach and did a lot of personal growth stuff on my own and with my coach, did I recognize that the stories that we tell ourselves really influence how we can succeed and fail, how we get stuck in cycles, how we react to situations. And what we tell ourselves is so very important. The self-talk that we tell ourselves, and it's really related to stories, this narrative integration. He talks about the connection to the narrative integration and attachment, how it's so important that you understand your attachment with your primary caregiver. That's normally your parent. I say that only because it could be an adoptive parent, grandparent, but that primary caregiver attachment really starts the narrative. And if you don't know it fully or you haven't explored it, you've blocked it off, this type of integration can really cause some major chaos for you in understanding how you deal with situations and getting the correct tools. This is the key to stopping cycles. Knowing how you are related to generational cycles is really about narrative integration. All right. Number 6 is state integration. The states of being, and there are very many, Basically, we have to accept that we have all these different layers and integrate them. That's how we meet our needs. That's how we move forward. That's how we get to radical acceptance, right? We can't ignore any of our states of being, but we tend to as people. We don't want to admit things. For me, self-compassion was a really hard integration, right? To be compassionate to myself, to let go, right, of guilt or shame or things of that nature and integrate it fully. And it's super important. Number 7 is interpersonal integration. And this is the we maps that he talked about earlier. Basically, how you can integrate connection, healthy, how you can link your past to your present, and how you do that through connecting with people. Because remember, he made a big kind of declaration that really, when you look at our mind, does not exist by itself. It is about the connection to the we. So that one is really important. And then the last one is temporal integration. This is those pleasant things of impermanence and mortality, basically time and death, and how scary that is. And through temporal integration, you really learn to find a way to connect and find comfort, even though you have uncertainty, which is another fantastic book, Being Comfortable with Uncertainty. And I just read that not too long ago. So how funny that I wrote that down and didn't even realize that until right now. However, very important part of integration. So he ends this chapter by basically saying that you can use all these 8 domains of integration and his model, and we're going to explore those further to basically create freedom through this mindsight. And basically, you need to have differentiation of all of the parts, but then you have to link them healthily, right? And that's integration. So you have all these differentiated parts. They're not having bad connections. You're not linking one unhealthily with another, but they're all differentiated on their own. There's not tons of bias. And then you're going to have all these other ones over here. And then we're going to link them together in healthy, connective ways. And we're going to achieve the ability to be on that river of harmony, that flow of integration. And I'm sure he's also going to talk about what happens when you bump up against the banks due to unforeseen obstacles. So that is the chapter. And I will post this on my YouTube channel, which is Best Self, Best Help. Health, not help. It's been a long day. Best Self, Best Health on YouTube. You can see my other videos on there. If you have comments or questions, you can feel free to comment on here, comment on YouTube, or shoot me a message in either place, and I will gladly speak to you about this. I hope you're reading along. If you're not reading along, I hope this is informative and kind of cool to watch and catch up on Mindsight by Dr. Daniel Siegel. And I will see you next week.